Hey guys, tonight we are trading the familiar hum of refrigerators and distant traffic for something much older, much quieter, and perhaps a little more spooky. We're stepping back to the medieval era centuries ago, and specifically, we're pulling up a heavy wooden stool inside a royal castle as night begins to fall. Picture the scene: the sun has dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fading oranges and purples outside the arrow slits. The massive stone walls around you are growing darker, colder. The sounds of the daytime, the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter in the courtyard, the distant bleating of sheep, are slowly dying down. A different set of sounds begins to emerge, the sounds of stone wood and the wind settling down for the night. It's a world without electric lights, without consistent heating, where the darkness feels deeper, the silence more profound, and the sounds that are there seem louder sometimes, unnervingly so. Let's be honest. Spending a night in a real medieval castle without modern conveniences, between the drafts, the smells, and the things that go bump in the night, probably just mice. Hopefully, you probably wouldn't survive the sheer lack of comfort long enough to fall asleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. It's always wild to see how far these bedtime journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in a courtyard, or perhaps just inside the main gate, as the last light leaches from the sky. The huge stone walls loom around you, solid and imposing guardians against the outside world. The heavy gate is likely being secured, massive timbers being slid into place with a resonant thud that echoes in the enclosed space. The air is cooler now than during the day, carrying the scent of damp stone earth. Perhaps the faint lingering smell of wood smoke from kitchen fires and the ever-present aroma of horses and livestock from the stables within the outer bailey. It's a rich, earthy smellscape vastly different from the clean, sterile scents we're used to. As darkness deepens, the landscape changes visually. Gone are the bright, varied colors of daytime. Now everything is rendered in shades of gray and black, save for the few points of light appearing here and there. Torches, their flames flickering wildly, are being placed in sconces along walls and corridors. Candles are lit in windows, casting pools of warm, flickering light onto the stone floors and rough plastered walls within rooms. Moonlight, if the sky is clear, might stream through unglazed windows or arrow slits, creating stark, angular patterns of light and shadow. Navigating requires care. Stubbing your toe on an uneven stone in the near darkness is a genuine hazard. Imagine trying to find your way to the kitchen for a midnight snack. It would be less about stealth and more about hoping you don't trip over a sleeping guard dog or walk into a wall. It's basically living life permanently in low power mode. The sounds of the castle at night are a study in contrast to our modern world. There's no constant drone of traffic, no distant sirens, no refrigerator humming, no always-on electronics. The background noise level as we know it simply didn't exist. Instead, you hear the sounds of the natural world and the building itself. The wind becomes a character whistling through ill-fitting window frames, sighing around turrets, sometimes rattling a loose shutter. The massive wooden timbers of the floors and ceilings creak and groan as the temperature drops, the ancient structure settling. Water might be heard dripping somewhere deep within the stone. Animal sounds are more prominent. The shifting and snorting of horses in the stables, the rustling of straw, perhaps the hoot of an owl perched on a battlement, the scurrying of mice or rats within the walls, a constant, unwelcome presence. These natural sounds, often masked by daytime activity, assert themselves in the quiet of the night. A mainstream historical fact about medieval life is the sheer lack of artificial light and constant mechanical noise compared to pre-industrial societies. Night was genuinely dark, and sounds traveled differently in the relative silence. Within the castle walls, human sounds are muted. Footsteps echo loudly on stone floors, so people move deliberately, perhaps wearing soft-soled shoes indoors. Voices are kept lower, conversations hushed, particularly in the private residential areas. A door closing, a log shifting on a fire, the clink of a guard's armor in a distant corridor. These simple sounds are amplified in the quiet. You become hyper-aware of every noise, every creak and rustle. The darkness of the medieval night wasn't just a physical state, it had psychological dimensions too. With limited light and increased quiet, the imagination could run wild. Shadows seemed deeper, more menacing. Unfamiliar sounds could easily be interpreted as something sinister. A quirky tidbit about medieval fears is the widespread belief in various nighttime spirits or creatures, bogies, ghosts, or other supernatural entities that were thought to be more active after dark. The rustling in the walls wasn't just mice, it could be something far less mundane in a fearful mind. It's like the original monsters under the bed, except sometimes the bed was just a mattress on the floor and the monsters were arguably more plausible given the sounds. The movement of time itself felt different at night. Without electric clocks, time was measured by natural cycles, the burning down of candles, or perhaps the sounding of a bell by a watchman. The night felt long, a period of rest and potential vulnerability between one day and the next. As the castle settled, life retreated into private chambers gathered around the flickering light of fires and candles. Even in this quiet, and despite the need for rest, music sometimes found a place. While grand musical performances might be for daytime feasts or courtly gatherings, quieter forms of music could accompany the transition to sleep, particularly for the inhabitants of the private chambers, the royal family. The contrast between the potential sounds of the night outside the heavy chamber doors and the sounds within, perhaps a crackling fire, soft voices, and gentle music, would have been striking. There's an open scholarly debate about the extent to which the medieval soundscape dominated by natural noises and lacking constant artificial sound impacted human sleep patterns and overall sensory perception. Did people sleep more deeply? Were they more attuned to subtle sounds, or was the constant threat of potential intrusion or the discomforts of the environment disruptive to true rest? It's a question about how our ambient environment shapes our most fundamental biological processes. Here's a slightly quirky tidbit. Medieval records occasionally include complaints about noise, showing that even without cars and factories, people were sometimes bothered by sounds. Examples include noisy craftsmen working late, animals being too loud, or people causing disturbances. This reminds us that noise pollution in some form has probably always existed when humans live in close proximity, even if the sources of that noise were vastly different. This contrasting soundscape is important when we think about music in the medieval castle, particularly quiet music intended for private spaces. In a world where silence was not a constant hum, but an intermittent state punctuated by distinct sounds, a sustained melody, even a soft one, would have been a more powerful presence. It would have filled the quiet in a way that music today often struggles to do against competing sounds. As the castle settled into its nightly state of relative quiet, the deliberate introduction of music into private chambers would have been a significant auditory event, a curated sound designed to bring comfort and order to the natural, unpredictable noises of the medieval night, leading us deeper into the chambers where such music might be heard. You've settled into the nocturnal rhythm of the castle, the daytime clamor, receding, replaced by the sounds of stone, wood, and wind. As the flickering light of torches and candles casts long, dancing shadows, you become acutely aware of the different soundscape you've entered. This isn't just any quiet. It's the quiet of a world before the relentless thrum of industrial and technological noise, a world that sounded fundamentally different from our own. Compare it for a moment to a modern night. Even in supposedly quiet areas today, there's a low, constant background hum. The distant drone of traffic, the faint whine of electronics, the pervasive presence of electrical grids, HVAC systems, airplanes overhead. Our world is saturated with noise, a dense, multi-layered tapestry of sound that is always on. You might not consciously notice it, but it's there, a constant companion. The medieval world, particularly at night, lacked this constant baseline noise. It wasn't necessarily silent, far from it, but the sounds were different. They were often sharper, more distinct, and crucially more intermittent. During the day, the world was filled with the sounds of human labor, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith, the sawing of wood, the calls of merchants in the market, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the quacking of ducks. Natural sounds were more prominent too. The chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, the rush of wind and water. These sounds were often tied to specific activities or natural events. They had a beginning and an end. They weren't a continuous wall of noise. As night fell, many of these sounds ceased. Human activity slowed dramatically due to the lack of effective lighting. Crafts stopped, markets closed, fields were empty. The dominant sounds became those of the natural environment and the built environment settling down. The wind whistling around the castle turrets, the creaking of the ancient timbers, the drip of water in a damp corner, the stirrings of animals in the stables or the castle grounds. Outside the castle walls, the sounds of the surrounding wilderness, the howl of a wolf, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves, would have been far more audible than they are in most places today. The absence of constant low-level noise meant that individual sounds, even quiet ones, could seem louder and travel further. A voice raised in conversation, footsteps on stone, the distant bark of a dog. These sounds would cut through the relative quiet more sharply. This might have made medieval people more sensitive to subtle auditory cues, more aware of the sounds around them. It's like turning off all the appliances in your house at night and suddenly hearing the faint tick-tock of a clock you never noticed before. That's a tiny glimpse into the shift in auditory perception. A mainstream historical fact about the medieval soundscape is that public life was often structured around distinct, non-mechanical sounds. Church bells marked the hours and called people to prayer or assembly. The calls of town criers or vendors announced news or goods. Natural sounds like cock crows marked the beginning of the day. Time and events were often perceived and communicated through these clear, punctuated sounds, rather than the continuous blended noise of modernity. Think about trying to sleep in this environment. While there wasn't traffic noise, other sounds could be equally, if not more, disruptive. A sudden storm with thunder echoing off the stone walls, the persistent scurrying of rodents within the very walls of your chamber, the unpredictable call of a wild animal nearby, or the measured tread of a watchman outside your door. Sleep wasn't accompanied by a steady hum, but by a series of distinct, sometimes startling noises. A joke could be that the medieval version of a white noise machine was just a particularly windy night. Or maybe someone snoring in the next chamber, because, let's face it, some noises are truly timeless. Despite the potential for sudden sounds, the overall lack of constant background noise likely meant moments of genuine deep quiet were more accessible. Stepping away from human activity, perhaps into a forest or onto a remote hillside, would have offered a level of silence that is incredibly rare in most populated areas today. This relative quiet, particularly at night, would have made intentional sounds like music stand out more powerfully. There's an open scholarly debate about whether living in such a different sound environment affected medieval cognition or sensory processing. Did they have a greater capacity for listening? Were they less bothered by sharp, sudden noises because they were accustomed to them, or more so because there was less to mask them? Some scholars argue that modern constant noise has led to a form of sound blindness, where we tune out much of our auditory environment, something medieval people couldn't afford to do. It's a fascinating question about how technology and environment shape not just our world, but our perception of it. Here's a slightly quirky tidbit. Medieval records occasionally include complaints about noise, showing that even without cars and factories, people were sometimes bothered by sounds. Examples include noisy craftsmen working late, animals being too loud, or people causing disturbances. This reminds us that noise pollution in some form has probably always existed when humans live in close proximity, even if the sources of that noise were vastly different. This contrasting soundscape is important when we think about music in the medieval castle, particularly quiet music intended for private spaces. In a world where silence was not a constant hum but an intermittent state punctuated by distinct sounds, a sustained melody, even a soft one, would have been a more powerful presence. It would have filled the quiet in a way that music today often struggles to do against competing sounds. As the castle settled into its nightly state of relative quiet, the deliberate introduction of music into private chambers would have been a significant auditory event, a curated sound designed to bring comfort and order to the natural, unpredictable noises of the medieval night, leading us deeper into the chambers where such music might be heard. You've explored the soundscape of the medieval night and seen where music found its place within the castle walls, from the echoing grandeur of the Great Hall to the quiet intimacy of private chambers. Now let's turn our attention to the people who made that music, the individuals who brought melody and rhythm to the lives of kings and queens. Medieval courts were centers of patronage not just for visual arts or literature, but for music as well, attracting a variety of performers, composers, and musical entertainers. At the highest echelon were the esteemed composers and choir masters, particularly those associated with the court chapel. These were often educated men, sometimes clergy who were skilled in the complex musical theories of the time, capable of composing intricate polyphonic music with multiple independent melodic lines for religious services. Their work was often formally notated and preserved, forming a significant part of the surviving medieval musical canon. They held positions of respect and authority within the castle's religious life. Think of them as the classical composers of their day, creating music designed to elevate the spirit and impress with its intellectual and artistic complexity. Alongside the composers, courts employed skilled instrumentalists. These were musicians dedicated to mastering specific instruments: lutes, harpies, viols, flutes, early forms of keyboard instruments, and various wind and percussion instruments. They might perform together as ensembles for formal occasions or play solos in more intimate settings. These court musicians were often permanent members of the household staff, their livelihoods tied directly to the generosity and musical tastes of their royal patrons. Their skill was highly valued, and they were essential for providing the expected musical backdrop to courtly life. Further down the social scale, but perhaps more ubiquitous and certainly more diverse in their talents, were the minstrels and jongleurs. These were often itinerant performers, traveling from castle to castle, town to town. While some were skilled musicians, others offered a wider range of entertainment. Singing songs, often epic tales, ballads, or love songs, telling stories, reciting poetry, juggling acrobatics, even performing simple magic tricks. They were the all-around entertainers, bringing news gossip and amusement from the outside world into the castle walls. Their music was often simpler, more focused on melody and rhythm for singing and dancing, and much of it was passed down orally rather than written down. A mainstream historical fact is the significant social and professional hierarchy among medieval musicians. A highly educated choir master serving in a royal chapel held a very different status than a traveling minstrel seeking payment for a performance in the courtyard. Patronage from the nobility was crucial for the careers of more formal musicians and composers, providing stability and resources. The different types of musicians were often suited to different castle environments. The choir master and chapel musicians performed in the chapel, their music designed for worship. Court instrumentalists might play intricate pieces in the great hall for feasts or perform more delicate melodies in private chambers for the royal family's entertainment. Minstrels, with their more varied repertoire and performing styles, might entertain in the great hall during less formal parts of a feast in the courtyard, or even sometimes be called upon to provide entertainment in other parts of the castle. The transmission of music in the medieval era was a blend of oral tradition and written notation. Complex religious and courtly music was increasingly written down using various forms of medieval musical notation, allowing it to be preserved and performed accurately. However much popular music, including many secular songs, dances, and simpler melodies sung by common folk, and likely some of the simpler music heard even in castles, was passed down by ear-learned and performed from memory. This oral tradition is one reason why recovering the full spectrum of medieval music, especially the more informal or private kinds, is challenging for historians. Here's a quirky tidbit about minstrels. Some were expected to be walking encyclopedias of stories and songs, able to perform pieces requested by their patrons from a vast memorized repertoire. Their minds were essentially medieval databases of entertainment and oral history. Imagine having to carry hundreds of songs and tales in your head, ready to perform on demand. No Spotify playlists back then. It required an incredible memory and skill. There's an open scholarly debate about the literacy rates among different classes of medieval musicians. While chapel masters and composers were highly literate in musical notation, the extent to which other court musicians or traveling minstrels could read or write music, or even standard text, is less clear and likely varied widely depending on their background and training. This debate impacts how we understand the creation, dissemination, and evolution of different types of medieval music. As the castle settled for the night and the grand music of the day faded, which of these musicians might be involved in providing the quieter, more personal music suitable for winding down, while a court musician might play a lute softly in a private chamber for a noble's relaxation. The music most directly associated with soothing and preparing for sleep, particularly for the youngest members of the royal family, might have involved different singers and a different repertoire altogether, often relying more on vocal performance than complex instrumentation, leading us deeper into the chambers where such music might be heard. You've heard the potential sounds of the instruments that filled the medieval castle, from the resonant lute to the clear harp, the versatile viol to the pure flute. These were the tools used by the musicians we discussed, brought together to create the varied soundtrack of courtly life. Let's explore the instruments they played, the sounds they produced, and how these musical tools contributed to the auditory landscape of the medieval court, particularly in those quieter private moments. Think about the instruments suited for the intimacy of a private chamber, or music not meant to fill a vast hall. String instruments were particularly popular and versatile. The lute, a pear-shaped plucked string instrument, was a favorite in courtly circles. It typically had multiple strings, often in pairs called courses, and was played by plucking with the fingers. The sound of a medieval lute is resonant warm and can be surprisingly expressive, capable of both delicate melodies and more rhythmic accompaniment. It's a sound that feels intimate and contemplative, well suited for a chamber setting. Imagine sitting by the fire, the soft, round notes of a lute filling the air, a gentle counterpoint to the crackling logs. The harp was another prominent string instrument, often depicted in medieval art and associated with nobility and angelic sounds. Medieval harps were typically frame harps, smaller than modern concert harps. They were played by plucking the strings with the fingers. The sound of a medieval harp is clear, pure, and melodic, with a shimmering quality perfect for playing beautiful arpeggios or accompanying a singer with a limpid, flowing harmony. Its tone is often described as ethereal, and it would have brought a sense of calm and beauty to any room it was played in. Think of crystal clear notes hanging in the air like suspended droplets of sound. Bowed string instruments were also common, perhaps the most versatile being the viol, or medieval fiddle. This instrument, held and played with a bow, could produce a sustained lyrical sound capable of carrying a melody expressively. Viols came in various sizes and shapes, but they were workhorses of medieval secular music, used for everything from accompanying songs to playing dance tunes. The sound could be reedy and robust or smooth and singing, depending on the instrument and the player's skill. It was an instrument capable of a wide range of expression, suitable for both lively and more somber music. Woodwind instruments like flutes and recorders were also present. Made of wood or bone, these instruments produced a pure, clear tone by blowing air across or into an edge. Their sound is often simple and direct, capable of sweet melodic lines. While they could be used in ensembles, a lone flutist playing a gentle melody would have created a lovely, pure sound in a quiet space. Their sound feels very natural, like birdsong captured in wood. Quieter percussion instruments might also be used, not the booming drums of battle or ceremony, but smaller hand drums like the tambourine, often without jingles, for a softer effect, or simple frame drums to provide a subtle rhythmic pulse. These weren't about volume, but about adding a gentle, steady beat. Comparing these sounds to modern instruments is key. Medieval instruments generally had less volume and sustain than their modern counterparts. Plucked instruments like the lute and harp required constant plucking to maintain the sound. Bowed instruments and winds could sustain notes, but their overall volume was limited compared to, say, a modern piano or a brass section. The timbre or tone color was also often different, partly due to materials, gut strings versus metal or nylon, and construction methods. Tuning systems were based on different modes, which give medieval music its characteristic melodic flavor, distinct from our modern major-minor system. The dynamic range, the difference between the softest and loudest sounds, was also more limited. You couldn't easily go from a whisper to a roar on a medieval instrument like you can on many modern ones. This meant that music's expressiveness came more from melody, rhythm, and subtle variations in playing technique. A mainstream historical fact is that while medieval instruments might seem simple to us, they were capable of great artistry in the hands of skilled musicians, and were integral to the performance of both complex polyphony and simple songs. The limitations in volume meant that in large, noisy spaces like the Great Hall during a feast, only the louder instruments, trumpets, shawms, drums, could truly cut through the din. But in quieter settings like a private chamber, the subtler sounds of the lute harp, vielle, or flute could be fully appreciated. These instruments were perfect for providing background music for conversation, accompanying a singer, or simply offering a moment of musical beauty for personal enjoyment. It's like trying to play a medieval lute over the sound of a full medieval banquet was about as effective as trying to serenade a rock concert crowd with a ukulele. You needed the right tool for the right noise environment. There's an open scholarly debate about how accurately we can reproduce the sounds of medieval instruments today. While modern instrument makers build reproductions based on historical descriptions and surviving examples, the exact materials, construction techniques, and even the way they were played can be subjects of interpretation and debate. Did gut strings always sound a certain way? Were bowing techniques different? Did players use vibrato? These questions make reconstructing the authentic medieval musical feel a challenging endeavor. It's like trying to perfectly recreate a recipe from vague descriptions and a list of ingredients that might or might not be complete. You might get close, but some flavor notes might be missing. Here's a slightly quirky tidbit. Some medieval illustrations of instruments show playing techniques that look quite different from modern ones, suggesting variations in posture, hand position, or bowing. For example, some depictions show the vielle being held against the chest or shoulder in ways that differ from modern violin or viola technique. Understanding these visual cues can sometimes provide clues about how the instrument was physically interacted with, potentially impacting its sound and ease of playing. As we consider the music played in private chambers, particularly music intended for rest, the sounds of these quieter instruments, the gentle pluck of a lute or harp, the soft, sustained note of a vielle, the clear tone of a flute, are the ones that come to mind. They were capable of creating a calming atmosphere, providing a soothing presence in the room. These were the sounds that could accompany quiet moments, moments of reflection, or the slow drift toward sleep, leading us to the types of music specifically created for noble ears and ultimately the most intimate music of all. You've journeyed through the echoing halls where grand music entertained the court and seen the instruments that produced those sounds. You understand the difference between the public spectacle of music and the quieter needs of private moments. As the medieval night truly descends upon the castle, let's leave the more public areas behind and step into the private living spaces of the royal family. The chambers where the king, queen, and their children sought rest away from the formalities of courtly life. Royal chambers were designed to be sanctuaries within the bustling and sometimes cold castle. Unlike the vast, often sparsely furnished Great Hall, these rooms were smaller, more contained, and focused on comfort and privacy relative to the era. You'd find heavier wooden furniture, chests for storage chairs, tables. Fireplaces were essential for warmth, casting a flickering glow and filling the air with the scent of wood smoke. Walls might be covered with tapestries, which served not only as beautiful decoration, often depicting scenes from mythology, history, or hunting, but also helped to insulate the stone walls, reducing drafts and making the room feel warmer and softer acoustically. The floors might be covered with rush matting, or for the wealthiest, perhaps even early forms of woven carpets, adding another layer of comfort compared to bare stone. These chambers typically included a bedchamber where the primary occupants slept, perhaps an antechamber for receiving close visitors or attendants, and possibly a smaller private space for reading or writing. The atmosphere was more intimate, the social circle smaller, limited to the royal family members present and their most trusted personal attendants. Ladies in waiting for the queen, valets for the king, and other close servants. The heavy wooden doors, often reinforced, provided a degree of physical and auditory separation from the rest of the castle. As evening deepened and the castle wound down, activity in the chambers would become quieter. Attendants would help their masters or mistresses prepare for bed, fires would be banked, and the primary light would come from candles and oil lamps, casting areas of warm light and deep shadow. The sounds would be hushed. The rustle of clothing, quiet voices, the crackling of the fire, the soft tread of attendants moving about. It was a distinct shift from the more public sounds of the daytime castle. Among these private chambers, none was perhaps more important and more focused on a unique set of needs than the royal nursery. This was the domain of the youngest members of the royal family, particularly the infant heir whose health and safety were paramount for the continuation of the dynasty. The nursery would be set up within a chamber furnished with the necessities for infant care. The central piece would be the cradle or crib. For royalty, this could be quite an elaborate piece of furniture, sometimes decorated, or even designed with rockers that allowed it to be easily soothed with a gentle push. Swaddling was a common practice, binding infants snugly in cloth to keep them warm and feeling secure. The royal nursery was not a place where the king and queen spent all their time, especially in the earliest months of an infant's life. A mainstream historical fact about royal and noble households in the medieval period is that infants were typically cared for by a dedicated staff, most notably a wet nurse who provided breast milk and a team of nursemaids who handled the daily care, feeding, if not exclusively wet nursed changing, cleaning, swaddling, rocking, and crucially soothing. While the mother, the queen, might visit and spend time with her child, the primary caregivers in infancy were these attendants. This system was partly for practical reasons. Queens had many duties, partly due to beliefs about child rearing, and sometimes out of necessity if the mother was unable to nurse. The atmosphere in the nursery at night would have been one of quiet vigilance. While the rest of the castle slept, the nursemaids would be attending to the infant's needs, keeping the fire going for warmth, perhaps preparing warmed swaddling cloths. The sounds would be soft. The rustle of blankets, the gentle creak of a rocking cradle, hushed whispers between the attendants. The air might smell faintly of linen beeswax candles and perhaps the milky scent associated with infants. Here's a quirky tidbit about medieval infant care beliefs about health. And soothing could lead to some practices that seem strange to us. For instance, some sources mention beliefs in the power of certain amulets or rituals to protect infants from harm or evil spirits at night, and these might be present in the nursery. Or there might be specific techniques for rocking or holding the infant that were thought to ensure proper development. It highlights the blend of practical care and traditional beliefs surrounding the vulnerability of infants in an era of high mortality. Imagine the pressure on these nursemaids, tasked with keeping the future of the kingdom healthy through the night, using a mix of practical skills and perhaps a few superstitious rituals. The presence of the royal infant in the nursery created a unique need for a specific kind of sound, one that could cut through the potential disquiet of the medieval night, soothe a crying baby, and help the most important little person in the castle drift off to sleep. Unlike the grand polyphony of the chapel or the lively tunes of the great hall, the music needed here was intimate, repetitive, and calming. There's an open scholarly debate about the emotional dynamics within royal nurseries. Given that infants were primarily cared for by wet nurses and nursemaids, what was the nature of the bond between the royal parents and their children in infancy? Did the physical separation and reliance on attendants impact these relationships compared to other social classes where mothers were often the primary caregivers? It's a complex question about family structures and emotional connections within the specific context of medieval royal households. As you envision yourself in the quiet of the royal chambers, the light low, the fire warm, you turn your attention to the nursery just steps away. Inside a cradle sits, and within it lies the young prince or princess, perhaps restless in the night. The air is thick with the silent hope and quiet responsibility that surround this tiny, important life. And in this intimate space away from the grandeur of the court and the sounds of the sleeping castle arises the need for a sound specifically designed to bring comfort, peace, and slumber. The sound of a lullaby. You understand the many hats a medieval lullaby wore in the royal nursery? Not just a tool for sleep, but a source of comfort, a whisper of protection, an early introduction to the world of sound and language. Now let's listen as best as history allows us to the sound of that purpose, to the actual musical characteristics that made a medieval lullaby effective in settling a restless prince or princess in the quiet dark of the castle. Unlike the complex, multi-layered polyphony that might fill the chapel or entertain nobles in the great hall, remember that intricate music from Section 6 medieval lullabies were almost certainly much simpler in their musical structure. The most likely form was monophonic, meaning a single unaccompanied melody line. Sometimes there might have been a simple drone accompaniment, perhaps played on a quiet instrument like a vielle or lute, where one or two notes are sustained continuously underneath the melody. But you wouldn't find the weaving together of multiple independent melodies that characterized the more formal music of the era. This simplicity wasn't a lack of artistry, it was functional. A single clear melody is less distracting and easier to focus on, both for the singer who might be tired or multitasking like rocking a cradle, and crucially for the listener trying to drift off to sleep. The melodies themselves were probably often quite simple and repetitive. They might consist of short, easily memorable phrases that are repeated perhaps with slight variations. The range of the melody, the distance between the lowest and highest notes, was likely narrow, making it comfortable to sing softly and consistently. Stepwise motion where the melody moves smoothly up or down to adjacent notes would be more common than large, sudden leaps, contributing to the gentle, flowing quality of the tune. Imagine a melody that feels like a gentle rocking motion itself, rising and falling smoothly, easy to follow even when half asleep. The rhythm of a medieval lullaby would also have been crucial to its soothing function. While much medieval monophonic music wasn't written with precise rhythmic notation, leading to an open scholarly debate about the exact rhythms of many pieces, were they strict or more free, the rhythm of a lullaby was likely tied to the natural rhythms of soothing actions. The steady beat of a heart, the gentle sway of a rocking cradle, the rhythm of breathing. This would suggest a relatively steady rocking or flowing rhythm, perhaps in simple meters, like what we would call 2/4 or 3/4 time, or even a more free rhythm that followed the natural stresses of the lyrics and the singer's voice. Repetition of rhythmic patterns, just like melodic phrases, would have reinforced the calming effect. The scales or modes used in medieval music give it a distinctive sound compared to our modern music, based on major and minor scales. Medieval modes are different patterns of notes within an octave each with its own characteristic flavor. Some modes might sound slightly more melancholic, others more serene, some perhaps more lively. While we don't know which modes were specifically favored for lullabies, the choice of mode would subtly influence the overall mood and feel of the melody, contributing to its soothing quality. It's like choosing between different color palettes for a painting. Each mode gives the music a unique hue that affects how it's perceived. The repetition of musical phrases and rhythmic patterns is a key feature of effective soothing music across cultures and time periods. It creates predictability, a sense of order and continuity that is comforting to a developing brain. In a medieval nursery surrounded by potential unfamiliar sounds in the dark, the reliable repeated melody and rhythm of a lullaby would have created a predictable auditory environment, helping the infant feel secure. It's the musical equivalent of saying, "Everything is okay, I am here and the world is predictable." While the core structure was likely simple, individual singers might have added subtle variations, changing the dynamic, singing softer or slightly louder, adding small ornaments to the melody, or varying the rhythm slightly to match the infant's mood or the rocking motion. This element of improvisation would have made each performance personal and responsive to the specific situation. A quirky tidbit is that while we have some examples of medieval songs with basic notation, how much singers embellished or altered these in performance, especially in informal settings like a nursery, is largely unknown, making the exact historical sound hard to pin down. Compared to the lively dance tunes or the intricate polyphonic motets of the court or chapel lullabies were functionally different. They weren't meant to impress with virtuosity or complexity or to stir the emotions in a dramatic way. Their purpose was singular to calm. This demanded a musical language of simplicity, repetition, and gentle rhythm. A joke could be that if a medieval composer tried to sing one of their complex motets as a lullaby, the baby would likely just get confused and cry louder. Some music is meant for thinking, some for dancing, and some, like lullabies, are purely for letting go and dreaming. The simplicity of the musical design of medieval lullabies, likely monophonic, with repetitive, narrow-range melodies, gentle rhythms, and the distinct flavor of medieval modes, made them perfectly suited for their multi-layered purpose in the royal nursery. They were easy for the caregiver to sing, consistently calming in their predictability, and effective in creating a pocket of soothing sound in the quiet castle night. This simple musical framework provided the vessel for the words that would accompany the melody, the lyrics that added another layer of meaning to these ancient songs of sleep. You've heard the simple, repetitive melodies and gentle rhythms that likely characterized medieval lullabies, the musical foundation designed for soothing and calm in the quiet castle night. Now let's turn our attention to the words that would have accompanied those tunes the lyrics whispered or softly sung to a restless royal infant or young child. While direct verified examples of lullabies sung specifically to medieval kings in their infancy are incredibly scarce, we can analyze themes found in lullabies across time and cultures and consider what elements might have been unique to the medieval and royal context. Universally, lullaby lyrics share common themes aimed at encouraging sleep. You would expect to find simple calls to slumber, urging the child to close their eyes to rest to sleep soundly. Phrases like "sleep, my darling," "close your eyes, my little one," or "go to sleep now" are timeless components. These direct appeals reinforce the primary purpose of the song, to bring about sleep. Nature is another very common theme in lullabies, used both for gentle imagery and sometimes as a metaphor for the transition to sleep. Lyrics might mention the setting sun, the appearance of the stars or moon, the quieting of birds or other animals as night falls, connecting back to the sounds of the medieval night we discussed. The wind might be mentioned perhaps as a gentle force rocking the world or a sound to ignore. Simple narratives about sheep or other animals going to rest are also classic lullaby material, perhaps contributing to the possibly medieval origin of counting sheep as a method for falling asleep. These natural images provide a calm, familiar backdrop for the song. Simple descriptions of the child themselves or their immediate surroundings could also feature in lyrics, mentioning the baby's eyes, hands, or movements, or referencing the cradle, the room, or the castle walls in a comforting way. These personal touches make the song specific to the child and their environment, reinforcing their sense of place and security. Expressions of love, tenderness, and reassurance from the singer to the child are also fundamental, conveying emotional warmth and safety through the words. Now, considering the unique context of a medieval royal nursery, what elements might have subtly or explicitly been woven into these lyrics? While we must be cautious due to the lack of direct evidence, it's plausible that elements related to the child's status or lineage could appear, particularly as the child grew beyond infancy into toddlerhood and could understand more. Perhaps gentle references to "my little lord" or "my lady," or even subtle hints about their future greatness or the importance of their family line. Lyrics might mention the castle they live in, the royal family they belong to, or the kingdom they might one day rule. These wouldn't likely be overt history lessons, but rather woven into simple phrases reinforcing identity within the royal context. The protective function we discussed in Section 8 might also manifest in the lyrics. Given medieval beliefs about infant vulnerability, lullabies could contain explicit or implicit protective elements. This might include invoking divine blessings, "may angels watch over you," mentioning saints or religious figures, or even cautionary phrases intended to ward off perceived dangers, both real and supernatural. "Sleep soundly and let no harm come near." These words could be seen as a form of sonic charm, an extra layer of protection sung into the dark. A quirky tidbit about historical lullabies, not just royal, is that some indeed contain surprisingly dark or cautionary lines, sometimes warning the child to sleep, lest they face negative consequences like being taken away, perhaps reflecting the harsh realities or prevalent fears of the time. While unsettling to modern ears, these might have been intended as serious warnings or even metaphorical protection. It's like the medieval version of "close your eyes or the Sandman won't come," but with slightly higher stakes. The language used in medieval lullabies would have been the vernacular language of the court and the region, not Latin, which was used for formal religious and scholarly purposes. This made the lyrics accessible and intimate, sung in the language of daily life. The style would likely be simple, direct, and repetitive, mirroring the musical structure to enhance memorability and soothing effect. A mainstream historical fact about medieval lyrics is that oral tradition played a huge role in their transmission, especially for folk songs and informal music like lullabies. While some courtly poems and songs were written down, many simpler lyrics were passed from one person to another through singing and repetition across generations. This is another reason why finding original medieval lullaby lyrics is difficult. They weren't considered important enough to be formally notated like religious texts or courtly poetry, There's an open scholarly debate about how much the content of medieval lullaby lyrics, particularly the more cautionary or seemingly dark elements, truly reflected the daily fears, anxieties, and beliefs about the supernatural held by the people singing them, often nursemaids or mothers, versus being simply traditional phrases passed down without deep reflection. Did the lyrics genuinely aim to instruct or protect, in a literal sense, or were they primarily formulaic expressions aimed at achieving the soothing effect using familiar cultural touchstones? It's a question about the relationship between folklore belief and functional communication in simple songs. The lyrics of a medieval royal lullaby, therefore, would have been a fascinating blend of universal human themes: the need for sleep, the comfort of nature, expressions of love, combined with the specific context of medieval life references to darkness, potentially fears, and the unique status of a royal child. Subtle hints of lineage or future. Carried on simple, repetitive melodies, these whispered words created a miniature world of sound and meaning in the quiet of the royal nursery, a personal narrative woven into the fabric of sound, sung by the person closest to the child in those crucial moments. You've listened to the potential sounds of medieval lullaby melodies and explored the likely themes within their lyrics, a blend of universal soothing and hints of the specific medieval and royal context. Now let's consider the most crucial element of the lullaby, not just the music or the words, but the voice that delivered them and the person behind that voice. Understanding who sang these sleepy tunes to royal children tells us much about the intimate world of the nursery and the bonds formed within it. In the medieval royal nursery, the primary singers of lullabies were typically the women who spent the most time with the infant, the nursemaids, and, if applicable, the wet nurse. As we discussed in Section 7, royal infants were commonly entrusted to the care of dedicated staff, allowing the queen to fulfill her many political and social duties. The wet nurse provided breast milk, a vital and respected role. The nursemaid, or often a team of nursemaids, was responsible for the day-to-day care, feeding, if not exclusively wet nursed, changing, cleaning, swaddling, rocking, and crucially soothing the infant when restless or crying. These women were a constant familiar presence in the infant's life, often spending far more hours with the child in their early months and years than the biological mother. They knew the baby's rhythms, its cries, what brought it comfort. Their voices heard throughout the day for various reasons. Gentle instructions, comforting murmurs, simple conversation were the most consistent human sounds in the infant's immediate world. When night fell and the need arose, it was their voice that would naturally be turned to singing a lullaby. The relationship between the nursemaid, wet nurse, and the royal child was often profoundly close. This was the person who provided constant physical comfort, who held them, fed them, and soothed them. The bond formed through this consistent, intimate care could be incredibly strong, sometimes lasting well into the royal person's adulthood. A mainstream historical fact about royal and noble households in the medieval period is that infants were typically cared for by a dedicated staff, most notably a wet nurse who provided breast milk and a team of nursemaids who handled the daily care. Feeding, if not exclusively wet nursed, changing, cleaning, swaddling, rocking, and crucially soothing. While the mother, the queen, might visit and spend time with her child, the primary caregivers in infancy were these attendants. This system was partly for practical reasons. Queens had many duties, partly due to beliefs about child rearing, and sometimes out of necessity if the mother was unable to nurse. The voice that sang the lullaby would likely not have been that of a formally trained musician from the court, unless perhaps in very specific circumstances, or as the child grew older and a tutor was involved. Instead, it would be the natural, untrained voice of a woman whose life was centered around caregiving. It might be a voice rough from work or age, perhaps not perfectly in tune by modern standards, but it would be warm, familiar, and consistent. The power of the lullaby came not from musical perfection, but from the sound of that specific voice associated with comfort, safety, and love in the infant's mind. Think about it after a long day, perhaps dealing with a colicky baby or a teething toddler in the quiet. Sometimes lonely confines of the nursery, the nursemaid would sit or stand by the cradle, gently rocking and sing. Her voice, perhaps tired but steady, would carry the simple melody and repetitive lyrics into the dimly lit room. This was a personal performance, just for one listener and perhaps any other attendants present, intimate and essential. A joke could be that the nursemaid's voice might not have won any medieval singing competitions, but to the royal baby it was better than any troubadour or court composer. It was the sound of safety and sleep. While the nursemaids were the primary singers of lullabies in infancy, the biological mother, the queen, might also sing to her children, particularly as they grew older and spent more intentional time together. However, the sheer amount of time spent by nursemaids in direct caregiving meant their lullabies were likely a more constant presence in the earliest years. Other members of the household, like older siblings or other close attendants, might occasionally sing to the child, but the core responsibility and consistent delivery came from the dedicated nursery staff. Here's a quirky tidbit about medieval wet nurses and nursemaids. They were often carefully chosen, sometimes based on physical characteristics like health and temperament, or even their social background, as it was believed these qualities could be passed to the child through the milk for wet nurses or close contact. Records sometimes include specific instructions or contracts detailing their duties and expected behavior. Some even continued to serve in different capacities later in the royal household, a testament to the enduring relationships built in the nursery. Imagine having a job interview where they checked your singing voice and your general disposition to see if you were suitable for soothing the future monarch. There's an open scholarly debate about the emotional impact of this system on royal children. Given that they spent their most formative attachment-forming years primarily in the care of nursemaids rather than their biological mothers, what was the nature of the emotional bond between royal parents and children? Did royal children form stronger primary attachments to their nursemaids? How did this affect their emotional development and later relationships? It's a complex question with varying historical interpretations, but it highlights the unique relational world the lullaby existed within for royalty. The singer's voice, therefore, was the heart of the medieval royal lullaby. It carried the music and words, but it also carried the weight of the caregiver's presence, their bond with the child, and the sense of safety and familiarity. It was a personal, untrained voice made powerful by its consistency, its warmth, and the intimate relationship it represented. It was this voice in the quiet of the castle night that wove the sonic tapestry of comfort and sleep for the child destined to wear a crown, a form of music utterly distinct from the grand performances of the court or chapel. You understand the unique place the medieval lullaby held, distinct from the grand formal music of the court and chapel, sung by caregivers rather than professional musicians, intimate and functional rather than public and artistic. This unique nature, however, presents a significant challenge for anyone trying to understand exactly what these sleep songs sounded like, what their lyrics were, or how they were performed, particularly those sung to royalty in their most vulnerable moments. The simple truth is surviving historical evidence for medieval lullabies is incredibly scarce. Think about where we find historical information about medieval music. We find it in illuminated manuscripts containing liturgical music like Gregorian chant, carefully notated for church services. We find it in courtly manuscripts, preserving the songs of troubadour trouvère and court composers' music intended for noble ears and often associated with specific poets or patrons. Remember section 6. We find theoretical treatises discussing musical modes, composition, and performance practice, usually written by educated scholars, often clerics. These sources primarily document the music considered important, formal, and worthy of preservation by the people who had the means and literacy to write things down. Lullabies, by their very nature, fell outside these categories. They were primarily part of an oral tradition, as we discussed in section 12. They were learned by hearing passed down through generations of caregivers, mother to daughter, without ever touching parchment or ink. This reliance on oral transmission is perhaps the biggest reason why they are so rare in the historical record. The music wasn't seen as something that needed to be written down. It lived and changed in performance. It was ephemeral here, one moment in a quiet nursery, gone the next as the child drifted off to sleep. Furthermore, lullabies were considered low status by the standards of the time's record keepers. They were associated with women's work with childcare with the domestic sphere, aspects of life that were far less documented than the public male-dominated sphere's church-court battlefield. The scribes and scholars who created the surviving manuscripts were typically focused on what they deemed important for religious practice, courtly culture, or academic study. A simple song sung to a baby, even a royal one, would likely not have been considered noteworthy enough to consume valuable and expensive parchment. It's like expecting to find detailed blueprints for a child's simple wooden toy in the same archive as architectural plans for a cathedral. The perceived importance was simply on different scales. Even if someone had decided to write down a medieval lullaby, the musical notation systems of the time were better suited for other types of music. Early notation primarily indicated pitch, and later systems developed to show rhythm, but they were most effective for the standardized rhythms of chant, or the increasingly complex but structured rhythms of polyphony. The more flexible, perhaps free-flowing rhythm of a lullaby tied to rocking or breathing might have been difficult to represent accurately with the available tools. Capturing the nuances of a soothing voice or slight variations in performance would have been nearly impossible. So, what kind of evidence does exist? It's scattered and indirect. Occasionally we find references to lullabies within literary texts, poems, plays, or stories that mention a character singing a sleep song. These might give us clues about the lyrics or the context, but rarely provide musical notation. Later collections of folk songs compiled centuries after the medieval period sometimes include tunes or lyrics that feel very old and might potentially have roots in medieval lullabies, but tracing a direct lineage is incredibly difficult. Sometimes musical fragments that have a lullaby-like quality, simple repetitive, might be found embedded in other more formal musical works, perhaps used as a theme or inspiration, but they aren't presented as lullabies themselves. This scarcity poses a significant challenge for historians and musicologists. We know lullabies existed. They are a universal human practice, and medieval texts sometimes mention them. But definitively saying this is a medieval lullaby melody or these are the exact words sung to King so-and-so is almost impossible based on direct evidence from the medieval period itself. The historical record bias towards the formal and the elite is largely silent on the specific sounds of the nursery at night. There's an open scholarly debate about the extent to which we can truly reconstruct or understand the vast landscape of medieval folk and domestic music, including lullabies given the overwhelming bias in our surviving sources towards liturgical and courtly traditions. Can we reasonably infer their characteristics from later folk music or literary hints, or is that making too many assumptions? It's a fundamental question about the limits of historical knowledge when dealing with aspects of life that weren't considered worthy of formal documentation by the people of the time. Trying to piece together the sound of an entire genre from tiny scattered clues feels a bit like trying to reconstruct an entire library from just a few charred pages found in a field. You know, books existed and these are fragments, but the vast majority is lost. Here's a slightly quirky tidbit. One of the few medieval melodies often cited as potentially a lullaby is a 13th century piece called Señalil, found in a collection of troubadour songs. Its simple repetitive melody and a reference to a child in the lyrics have led some scholars to speculate it could have been used as or adapted from a lullaby, although it's presented as a courtly song. It highlights how we have to look sideways and make educated guesses based on the limited crumbs left behind. So while we know lullabies were sung, were essential, and were present even in royal chambers, the specific sounds and words remain largely lost to time, swallowed by the oral tradition that created them, and the historical biases that failed to preserve them. This challenges us, forcing historians to use educated guesswork and creative reconstruction to imagine the music that soothed kings, leading us to the methods they use to try and bring these lost sounds back to life. You've navigated the challenges of reconstructing lost medieval sounds, peering through the gaps in the historical record to imagine the melodies and rhythms that might have soothed royal ears in the quiet castle night. We've focused primarily on the royal context, the unique environment of the noble nursery. But this raises a fascinating question. Were the lullabies sung to future kings and queens fundamentally different from those sung to the children of peasants, merchants, or artisans in their far more humble homes? At the most fundamental level, the answer is likely no. The core purpose of a lullaby, right, to soothe a restless infant, to calm them with sound and presence to encourage sleep, is a universal human need transcending social class. The biological response of an infant to a gentle, rhythmic human voice is the same, regardless of whether they lie in a gilded cradle or a straw-filled cot. Thus, the basic musical characteristics we discussed, Section 9, likely monophonic or with simple drone repetitive phrases, gentle rhythms, narrow melodic range using medieval modes, were probably common to lullabies sung across the social spectrum. These are the musical features that are inherently calming and easy for an untrained voice to produce consistently. The method of transmission was also almost certainly the same oral tradition. Section 12. Lullabies in peasant homes, just like those in royal nurseries, were learned by hearing passed down through generations of caregivers, mother to daughter living in performance, rather than being written down. They were functional songs, part of the everyday practice of childcare, not considered formal musical compositions. However, while the core function and musical simplicity were shared, there were likely differences, particularly in the lyrical content and the identity of the singer. In a peasant home, the singer was most often the biological mother. The bond was mother-child, shaped by the shared daily life of labor and survival. The lyrics of a peasant lullaby would likely reflect that reality. Instead of subtle hints of lineage or castle walls, the words might reference the sounds of their environment. The wind in the fields, the lowing of the cow, the rhythm of the loom, or the hammer. Themes might include simple hopes for the child's health and strength for future labor, references to nature directly tied to their agricultural life, or perhaps simple narratives about farm animals going to sleep. The fears referenced might be more immediate. Wolves outside the cottage, hunger, illness, rather than the political anxieties or supernatural threats that might subtly feature in a noble context. A quirky tidbit is that some later folk song collections contain lullabies with lyrics that vividly describe rural life, or even include cautionary tales about dangers specific to a village setting. In the royal nursery, the primary singer, especially in infancy, was typically a nursemaid or wet nurse, section 11, an employee of the household, albeit often a trusted and beloved one. While a deep bond was formed, it was a relationship shaped by the social structure of service, different from the biological mother-child bond common in most homes. The social status of the singer themselves was also different. A servant singing to future royalty compared to a mother singing to her own child. The environment, too, played a role. The sounds of a peasant home at night were different from those of a stone castle, section 2. Perhaps more exposed to the sounds of nature outside fewer echoing stone corridors, different creaks and groans from a wooden structure. This could subtly influence the character or necessity of the lullaby, perhaps needing to be sung against different ambient sounds or emphasizing different aspects of safety. Could there have been differences in the quality or ornateness of the singing? This is highly speculative given the lack of evidence. While neither royal nursemaids nor peasant mothers were likely trained musicians, a royal household might potentially have had access to individuals with slightly more exposure to music or a naturally better voice. However, for the purpose of soothing an overly ornate or technically skilled performance might be counterproductive. The simple familiar voice was key. So any differences here were probably minimal in practice. A mainstream historical fact is the significant disparity in material culture and daily life between the nobility and the common people in the medieval period. Access to resources, education, diet, and living conditions vary dramatically, shaping every aspect of life, including domestic practices like childcare and the music heard within the home. There's an open scholarly debate about the permeability of musical styles and repertoire between different social classes in the medieval period. Did the nobility ever hear and adopt simpler folk songs, including lullabies? Did elements of courtly music ever filter down to influence the music of commoners? While rigid divisions existed, there was likely some exchange, making definitive claims about completely separate musical worlds challenging. It's a question of how much interaction and influence occurred in the complex social ecosystem of the time. Despite the potential differences in lyrics, singer, and environment, the heart of the lullaby remained the same. A simple sung expression of care and comfort aimed at bringing sleep to a child in the quiet dark. Whether sung by a queen or a peasant mother, a trusted nursemaid or an older sibling, the fundamental act of using the human voice to soothe a young human being with melody and rhythm was a shared universal practice. The lullabies that soothed kings likely shared more in common with the lullabies sung in the simplest cottages than they did with the complex polyphony of the royal chapel or the grand music of the court. You've considered the medieval worldview, which saw music not just as sound, but as a potent force connected to health, spirit, and cosmic order. adding a layer of significance to the lullaby's soothing purpose. Now let's bring our focus back to the recipients of that musical comfort, the royal children themselves, and explore the unique pressures and circumstances of their lives that might have made the gentle sound of a lullaby particularly important. Being born into medieval royalty meant entering a world of immense privilege, but also of profound, often invisible burdens, even from infancy. Royal children, particularly heirs, were not just ordinary children growing up. They were assets of the state, their very existence and well-being crucial for political stability and the continuation of the dynasty. Their health was a matter of public concern, any illness or vulnerability causing anxiety throughout the court and kingdom. This intense focus on their survival, while understandable given the high infant mortality of the era, a mainstream historical fact, placed an enormous, if unconscious, weight on their tiny shoulders from day one. Their upbringing, as we touched upon when discussing the singers of lullabies. Section 7, Section 11 was often highly structured and formal, even in the nursery. While surrounded by numerous attendants, nursemaids, wet nurses, governesses, tutors as they grew older, their interactions, particularly with their biological parents, could be more infrequent or formal than in other social classes. Queens had demanding roles in court and governance, and kings were often away dealing with political or military matters. While maternal and paternal affection certainly existed, the daily, intimate, informal care that many children received directly from their parents was often delegated. This created a potential for a unique kind of emotional solitude for royal children. Despite being constantly surrounded by people, the relationships were often defined by service and hierarchy. While many nursemaids and attendants were undoubtedly loving and formed deep bonds, the sheer number of caregivers and the formality of the court environment could mean a lack of consistent, spontaneous, and purely informal interaction that contributes to a child's emotional security. Furthermore, royal children were aware from a relatively young age of their unique position and the expectations placed upon them. Even before they could fully understand the concept of kingship, they would sense the difference in how they were treated, the attention they received, and the rules that applied to them. As they grew, this awareness would sharpen, accompanied by rigorous education and the understanding that their future was largely predetermined, tied to duty and lineage. This could lead to anxiety or a sense of being constantly observed and judged even in their own home. Beyond the internal pressures, external dangers were a very real concern. Royal children were potential pawns in political power struggles. Kidnapping for ransom or political leverage or even assassination were grim possibilities in the volatile political landscape of the medieval era. This meant security was paramount, potentially leading to a sheltered or even somewhat isolated existence within the castle walls, adding another layer to their unique environment. Imagine the constant unspoken tension that might permeate the nursery, a subtle awareness of vulnerability that even an infant might sense. These combined factors, the immense pressure of their status, the formal upbringing, the potential for emotional solitude despite being surrounded by people, the awareness of expectations and dangers, all contributed to a specific need for comfort, security, and unconditional soothing. The lullaby sung by a trusted caregiver provided this vital emotional support. It was a moment of predictable calm in a potentially unpredictable world. The familiar voice and melody cut through the formality and potential anxieties of castle life, creating a pocket of safety and warmth. There's an open scholarly debate about the long-term psychological impact of medieval royal upbringing. Did the reliance on attendants and the political pressures of their status lead to different personality traits or emotional challenges compared to individuals raised in less formal, more familial environments? Did the strong bonds with nursemaids compensate for potential emotional distance from parents? It's a complex question that requires careful consideration of the limited personal accounts available from individuals who experienced this unique childhood. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some historical accounts suggest that certain royal children were unusually attached to their nursemaids, or specific attendants, sometimes preferring their company to that of high-ranking nobles, or even their own parents as they grew older, underscoring the depth of the bonds formed during those crucial early years spent in the nursery. It highlights how even within a rigid social structure, personal relationships and emotional connections could flourish in unexpected ways. For a child carrying the weight of a future crown, the simple act of being sung to sleep was more than just a pleasant way to nod off. It was a consistent source of comfort against the inherent anxieties of their position, a moment of unconditional connection in a world of formality and expectation, and a vital contribution to their emotional security in a life lived under intense scrutiny and potential danger. The lullaby in the quiet of the royal nursery was not just music, it was a lifeline of comfort for a child destined for greatness. You've journeyed across medieval lands glimpsing the universal practice of the lullaby and comparing potential traditions in different cultures, finding common threads woven through diverse cultural tapestries. This timeless need to soothe a child with song didn't vanish with the end of the medieval era. Despite the scarcity of direct evidence for specific medieval lullabies, remember that frustrating silence in the archives from Section 13 elements of these sleepy tunes, or at least the tradition itself, likely survived and influenced later music, particularly the rich world of folk music. Because medieval lullabies were primarily part of an oral tradition, Section 12, they didn't get neatly filed away in archives of written music. Instead, they lived on people's lips, passed from one generation of caregivers to the next, their melodies and lyrics subtly shifting and evolving over time. Folk music, by its very definition, is music that is passed down orally within a community, outside of formal composition and notation traditions. This makes folk music collections from later centuries a key place for scholars to look for potential echoes of medieval musical practices, including lullabies. While it's incredibly difficult to definitively say this 18th century folk melody is the exact tune sung to a baby in a 14th century castle, we can look for recurring characteristics in later folk lullabies that align with what we'd expect from their medieval ancestors. One such characteristic is the use of modes section 9. While Western classical music largely shifted to the major and minor scales after the medieval period, modal melodies persisted in many folk traditions. Finding a folk lullaby with a distinct modal flavor, a melody that doesn't quite fit our modern major or minor ears, can be a hint of ancient origins. Other musical features that suggest potential medieval roots include simple melodic contours, melodies that move primarily by step within a relatively narrow range, making them easy to sing and soothing to hear. Repetitive structures like the repetition of short phrases or a simple theme with variations are also hallmarks of both medieval lullabies and many later folk songs, reinforcing their calming function and aiding memorization in oral transmission. Gentle rocking or simple rhythmic patterns. Section 9 found in later folk lullabies are also likely continuations of medieval practice. The lyrical themes Section 10 in folk lullabies also show continuity. Universal themes like calls to sleep, references to nature, the wind, the stars, animals settling down, and expressions of love and reassurance are common in lullabies across centuries. Even some of the more cautionary or protective elements found in historical lullabies occasionally persist in later folk traditions, though their meaning or interpretation might shift over time. The core vocabulary of sleep comfort and the world outside the window endures. The very act of passing down songs by ear, the core of oral tradition, kept the practice of the lullaby alive, even if the specific songs changed. Each singer might adapt the melody slightly, alter a few words, or combine elements from different songs they heard. This process of continuous recreation means that later folk lullabies are less direct copies of medieval ones, and more like descendants carrying some of the same musical and lyrical DNA, transformed by centuries of individual performances. It's like comparing a modern family member to a distant medieval ancestor. You can see some shared features, but they are definitely distinct individuals. A mainstream historical fact in musicology is the study of folk music as a crucial source of information about pre-literate or less documented musical traditions. Ethnomusicologists compare folk songs across regions and time periods to trace potential lineages and understand how music evolves through oral transmission. There's an open scholarly debate about the degree of continuity between medieval folk and domestic music, including lullabies and later folk traditions. While few would argue for exact one-to-one survival of specific songs without written notation, there are differing views on how many characteristics, melodic fragments, or rhythmic patterns were preserved. Was there a relatively stable core of folk musical vocabulary, or was it constantly reinventing itself? It's a question about the nature of change and preservation in oral cultures. Here's a quirky tidbit related to folk song survival. Some researchers have found folk melodies that use archaic modes or structures, rarely seen in composed music after the medieval period, suggesting they might be genuine remnants of older traditions. Finding these musical fossils in later folk collections is exciting for scholars trying to understand the sounds of the distant past. While we may never know the exact lullaby sung to a specific medieval king in his cradle, the enduring power of simple, repetitive melody, gentle rhythm, and heartfelt lyrics to soothe a child remains a constant. The core characteristics of medieval lullabies, born from function oral tradition and the intimate bond between singer and child, likely laid the groundwork for the lullabies sung in later centuries and resonate however faintly in the sleepy tunes we still sing today. The tradition of the sleepy tune didn't disappear. It simply evolved, echoing across time, bringing us to the final moments of night in the medieval castle. You have traced the journey of this simple yet profound form of medieval music. From the dark, quiet castle night and the needs of a royal infant through the people, places, sounds, and beliefs that shaped it, to the challenges of its preservation and its echoes in later times. You've imagined the voice, the melody, the words that created a pocket of peace in a grand, ancient world. The sounds of the medieval day have long since faded. The castle is quiet, and the music designed for sleep has achieved its purpose. And now the journey ends. You've stepped back out carrying the warmth and the memories. Let the sounds of the cento soften in your mind. The gentle lapping of the hot water, the distant rumble of the furnace, the quiet murmur of voices through the steam. Allow these sounds to become fainter, like a dream drifting away. The feeling of the heat on your skin, the steam on your face, the clean sensation. Just let them slowly dissipate like mist in the morning sun. There's nowhere else to go now, nothing else to see or do. The bathhouse is closing for the night. The street outside is quietening. Your body feels heavy, relaxed from the warmth, peaceful from the journey. It's time to let your thoughts soften, to let your breath deepen and slow. You are safe, you are warm, you're comfortable. Just ease into the quiet. Let the last images of steam and water fade away, and surrender to the calm, drifting into stillness. Resting now. Peaceful. End of script. Sweet dreams.